Senator from Utah.
I rise in opposition to the highway spending bill before us today, and not just the failed substance of the legislation. I rise to oppose the bill's irresponsible and unsustainable funding mechanisms and the cynical process that produced it. We're told that this bill fully funds federal highway spending for the next 5 years, and that it won't add a single dime to the federal deficit. The math may add up on paper, but does anyone really think the pay-fors in this bill are honest, responsible ways to fund a government program? Let's look at a few examples. Of the $70 billion this bill uses to bail out the Highway Trust Fund over the next 5 years, more than $50 billion comes from an accounting gimmick that steals money from the rest of the Treasury's general fund. Here's how the shell game works. Normally, the Federal Reserve sends the profits from its portfolio assets directly to the U.S. Treasury. These surplus profits are actually one of the major reasons our federal budget deficits have fallen in recent years, below where they were a short time ago. However, this bill would siphon off that money and redirect it into the Highway Trust Fund. Just today, the Federal Reserve Chair, Janet Yellen, testified before the Joint Economic Committee, where she commented on this particular provision, on this particular aspect of this bill. She said, quote, "This concerns me. I think financing federal fiscal spending by tapping resources at the Federal Reserve sets bad precedent and impinges on the independence of the central bank. It weakens fiscal discipline, and I would point out that repurposing the Federal Reserve's capital surplus doesn't actually create any new money for the federal government," close quote. And that's not the only funding gimmick found in this legislation. It also purports to raise $6.2 billion in revenue for transportation and infrastructure projects by selling oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Now, let's leave aside for a second that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was never intended to be a piggy bank for congressional appropriators. What makes this pay-for particularly objectionable is that its authors assume they can get $93 for a barrel of oil when it's currently selling for less than $40 per barrel. Only in Washington could we come to love a provision like this. Only in Washington could we come to accept a provision like this as somehow acceptable. If we're going to start selling federal assets at fantasy prices, prices that do not exist and will not exist in any universe for the foreseeable future, there's absolutely no limit whatsoever to the number of things that we can pretend to pay for. But that's what we'll be doing, pretending to pay. But as bad as this bill's funding schemes are, the cynical process used to secure votes in its favor might well be far more troubling. For instance, this bill adds back $3.5 billion in crop subsidy spending that we just cut last month in the budget deal. Now, is this really how we do business in the United States Senate, Mr. President? Reduce spending 1 month in order to appear fiscally responsible, only to reverse course the very next month when we think no one's looking. You don't need to oppose crop subsidies to see the dishonesty and the cynicism of this particular maneuver. Even worse, this bill would never have had a chance of passing the Senate were it not for a deal to include the renewal of the Export-Import Bank as part of this legislation. I've spoken out against the Export-Import Bank many times before, so there's little need to revisit the mountain of evidence proving that it is one of the most egregious, indefensible cases of crony capitalism in Washington, D.C. But it is worth highlighting some of the so-called reforms that EXIM supporters included in the bill. First, there's the new Office of Ethics created within the Export-Import Bank. Presumably, this is supposed to help the bank's management reduce the rate at which EXIM employees and beneficiaries are indicted for fraud, bribery, and other wrongdoings. Since 2009, there have been 85 such indictments, or about 14 per year. The bill also creates a new position called the Chief Risk Officer and requires the bank to go through an independent audit of its portfolio. Only in Washington, Mr. President, will you find people who believe that an organization's systemic ethical failings can somehow be overcome by creating a new ethics bureaucracy, or that hiring a new risk management bureaucrat is a suitable replacement for market discipline, or that giving another multi-million-dollar contract to a well-connected accounting firm will somehow substitute for real, actual political accountability. None of these bogus reforms will make an ounce of difference. None of them will change the essential purpose of the Export-Import Bank, which is to use taxpayer money to subsidize wealthy, politically connected businesses. Finally, Mr. President, it must be stressed that this bill does nothing to fix our fundamentally broken highway financing system. After this legislation is enacted, the Highway Trust Fund will spend more money than the federal gasoline tax brings in. And after this series of fraudulent pay-fors are exhausted, in just 5 years, we'll be right back to where we've been for the last decade. And that is trying to find enough money for another bailout without attracting too much attention from the American people. And let's not forget that the states are big losers under the status quo system, too, under the current system that we've got. Federal bureaucrats divert at least 25% of state gasoline tax dollars to non-highway projects, including mass transit, bike paths, and other boondoggles like vegetation management, whatever that is.
Would the senator yield? Let me just ask a favor, and I'll give you all the time you want. But you had asked for 5 minutes. I plan to respond to the things that you're saying that I don't agree with. But if you wouldn't mind, let the others who have come here to speak in the order that we agreed to, and then come back to you. Would that work?
Mr. President, I've left less than a page of my remarks that I've prepared left. I ask unanimous consent for permission to have an additional 2 minutes to complete my remarks.
Is there objection? Without objection.
As I was saying, federal bureaucrats divert at least 25% of state gas tax dollars to non-highway projects, including mass transit, bike paths, and other boondoggles like vegetation management. Federal Davis-Bacon price-fixing regulations then artificially inflate construction costs by at least 10%. And federal environmental regulations, like those issued under the National Environmental Policy Act, add an average of 6.1 years in planning delays to any federally funded project. I understand that Washington is not ready for a more conservative approach to infrastructure funding, at least not yet. One where states get to keep their transportation dollars and decide how and on what they'll spend those dollars, free from interference by federal regulators. We can have honest disagreements over policy, and I know there's more work to do in making the case for conservative transportation reform. But what I refuse to accept is the toxic process that produced this bill, the backroom deals, the about-face on crop subsidies, and the Export-Import Bank. The American people deserve better than this, and I won't stop fighting to ensure that we will do better than this in the future. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator.